The night was calm, but the air between Jesus and his disciples was thick with unspoken emotion. They had witnessed so much in the past months, healings, miracles, but also resistance, injustice, and cruelty. They had seen the faces of the oppressed and the downtrodden, heard the laughter of those in power who turned a blind eye to suffering. The weight of it all pressed on their hearts, and with that weight came an emotion that was difficult to express: anger. The fire crackled softly, its warmth comforting, but Peter's heart was anything but calm. He clenched his fists, wrestling with his feelings. His frustration had been building, and he could no longer keep silent. "Rabbi," Peter began, his voice edged with tension, "I am filled with anger. Anger at the Pharisees who mock your teachings, anger at the injustice that we see every day, anger even at myself for my own weaknesses. I want to act, to fight back, but I am afraid that my anger will lead me to sin. Is it wrong to feel this way?" His words hung in the air like the smoke from the fire, curling and rising, spreading through the group. Each of the disciples had felt the same at one time or another, an overwhelming, burning anger at the world's cruelty, at the pain they saw around them, at the obstacles that seemed to block the path of righteousness. Jesus looked at Peter with deep compassion. He could see the turmoil in his heart, the same turmoil that stirred in the hearts of all the disciples. After a moment of silence, Jesus spoke, his voice calm and filled with understanding. "Anger is not wrong," he said softly, "but it is a powerful force. Like fire, it can either destroy or purify depending on how it is used. If it is left to burn wildly, it will consume everything in its path. But if it is controlled, it can be a light that guides you, a warmth that motivates you." The disciples listened intently. They could feel the weight of Jesus' words sinking into their souls, but they needed more. They needed to understand how to harness this fire without being consumed by it. Jesus leaned closer to the fire, his face illuminated by its soft glow. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice carrying a sense of timeless wisdom. "It is the story of a young man, a son, who allowed his anger to blind him. Once upon a time, there was a father who owned a vast and fertile farm. The land had been passed down through generations, each father teaching his son the ways of the soil, the rhythm of the seasons, and the importance of patience and care. The farm had provided for the family for as long as anyone could remember, and it was more than just a place of work. It was their home, their heritage, their lifeblood. The father had 2 sons. The elder son was steady, hardworking, and calm, content to follow his father's example, learning the ways of the farm with quiet diligence. The younger son, however, was different. He was full of energy, ambition, and passion. He had dreams of making the farm even more prosperous than it had ever been, of expanding it, innovating, and proving himself to his father and the world. The younger son loved the land deeply, but his love was mixed with a desire to control it, to shape it to his will. He believed that with enough effort he could make the land yield more, grow faster, and become something greater than it had ever been before. For years the family worked together in harmony. The father, with his years of experience, guided his sons with a gentle hand, teaching them not only the practical skills of farming but also the deeper lessons of patience, humility, and respect for the forces of nature. The elder son followed his father's lead, working steadily, never rushing, trusting that the land would give what it could in its own time. But the younger son, driven by his ambition, often grew impatient. He would work late into the night, trying to push the crops to grow faster, to squeeze more from the earth. His hands were blistered, his body exhausted, but he felt alive in his efforts. He believed that if he worked harder than anyone else, he could bend the farm to his will. The father watched his younger son with both pride and concern. He admired his son's passion, but he also knew that the land had its limits. There were forces beyond human control, weather, seasons, and the delicate balance of nature, that no amount of hard work could overcome. He tried to warn his son, but the young man was too caught up in his dreams to listen. Then one year disaster struck. It was late in the growing season, and the crops were nearly ready for harvest. The fields were full of tall, golden wheat, the fruit of months of hard labor. The younger son walked among the crops, his heart swelling with pride. This was the year he had worked for. This was the year he would prove to his father and himself that he was capable of greatness. But then the skies darkened. A storm began to brew on the horizon, the clouds thick and heavy with rain. The winds began to howl, and the young man's heart sank as he realized what was coming. A powerful storm was about to sweep across the land, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The rain came in torrents, flooding the fields, battering the crops. The wind tore through the wheat, snapping the stalks, uprooting plants, and turning the once vibrant fields into a sea of mud and destruction. The storm raged for hours, and by the time it passed, the farm was in ruins. The young son stood in the middle of the wreckage, his heart pounding with a mixture of grief and fury. Everything he had worked for, everything he had poured his soul into, was gone. The crops were destroyed, the land was flooded, and his dreams lay in pieces at his feet. At first all he felt was shock. He could hardly believe what had happened. But as the days passed, the shock gave way to something darker. Anger began to bubble up inside him. Anger at the storm, anger at the land, anger at the forces of nature that had betrayed him. "Why?" he shouted into the empty fields one day, his voice shaking with rage. "Why has this happened? We worked so hard, and for what? Everything is ruined." His father, who had been working quietly nearby, heard his son's cries. He came to stand beside him, his face calm but filled with sadness. "My son," the father said gently, "the land has suffered, but it is not dead. There is still life beneath the soil. With time and care it will heal. We will rebuild." But the young man could not hear his father's words. His anger was too great, too consuming. "Heal?" he spat. "There is nothing left to heal. Everything is destroyed. How can you be so calm?" The father looked at his son with deep compassion. He had seen many storms in his lifetime, and he knew that the land could recover, just as it had many times before. But he also knew that his son's anger, if left unchecked, would cause more destruction than the storm itself. "I know you are angry, my son," the father said, "but anger will not restore what has been lost. It will only destroy what remains. Be careful with the fire in your heart." But the young man, blinded by his fury, could not listen. He turned away from his father and stormed off, his fists clenched, his heart burning with resentment. In the days that followed, the young man's anger continued to grow. He could not let go of his fury at the injustice of the storm. Every time he looked at the ruined fields, his heart burned with rage. He could not understand how his father could be so calm, so accepting of what had happened. To him it felt like giving up, like surrendering to defeat. Driven by his anger, the young man threw himself into his work, determined to fix what had been broken. But his anger clouded his judgment. He worked furiously, hacking away at the fallen plants, digging into the soil with reckless abandon. He ripped up what little remained of the crops in his frustration, believing that he could force the land to recover through sheer will. But his efforts were in vain. The more he worked, the more damage he caused. The soil, already weakened by the storm, became compacted and dry under his heavy-handed treatment. The few plants that had survived the storm were trampled and destroyed by his frenzied labor. His hands were blistered, his body was exhausted, but still, his anger drove him forward. Each night, he would return to the house, his muscles aching, his spirit worn down, but his anger still burning bright. And each night, his father would watch him with quiet sorrow, knowing that his son's rage was doing more harm than good. "Why are you doing nothing?" the son demanded one evening, his voice filled with bitterness. "Why do you sit there while the farm falls apart? Don't you care?" "I care deeply, my son," the father replied. "But anger will not fix what is broken. It will only make things worse. You must learn to let go of your anger, or it will consume you." The young man shook his head, unable to accept his father's words. To him, his anger felt justified. He could not understand why his father wasn't as furious as he was. How could he be so calm in the face of such loss? It felt like betrayal, like weakness. And so the young man continued on his path, driven by anger, consumed by it. Weeks passed and the young man's anger began to take its toll. His body was weary from the constant strain, his mind clouded by frustration. He had stopped listening to his father's advice, convinced that he could fix the land on his own. But one day as he stood in the middle of the ruined fields, something inside him broke. He had been working since before dawn, tearing at the soil, trying to salvage what he could, but it was no use. The land was beyond his ability to heal. The crops were gone, the soil was too damaged, and his hands, once so sure and strong, were now trembling with exhaustion. He fell to his knees in the mud, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and despair. His vision blurred with tears of frustration as he looked around at the destruction. All his efforts, all his anger had amounted to nothing. For the first time he felt utterly defeated. He had given everything he had and it still wasn't enough. The storm had won. The land had won. He had lost. As he sat there, his body trembling, his hands caked with mud, the young man's anger finally began to subside. In its place came something else, something deeper, something more painful. Grief. For the first time since the storm, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his grief. He had been so consumed by anger that he had pushed the grief away, refusing to face it. But now, sitting alone in the ruined fields, there was nothing left to hide behind. He wept, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very core of his being. He wept for the loss of the crops, for the land, for the dreams he had held so tightly. He wept for the anger that had driven him to destroy what little remained. He wept for his father, who had tried so hard to guide him, and whom he had ignored in his fury. And as he wept, something inside him shifted. The next morning the young man woke with a heavy heart. His body ached from the days of labor, and his hands were raw and blistered, but there was a new clarity in his mind. The anger that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of humility. He knew now that his father had been right all along. His anger, though powerful, had blinded him. It had driven him to act recklessly, to destroy rather than build. In his fury he had torn apart the very thing he had hoped to save. Filled with remorse, the young man made his way back to the fields. His father was already there, working steadily as he always had. The elder man's movements were slow and deliberate, filled with the patience of someone who understood the rhythms of the land, who knew that healing would take time. The young man approached his father, his head bowed in shame. "I was wrong," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I let my anger blind me. I couldn't see the life that still remained. Can you forgive me?" His father turned to him, his face filled with love and understanding. Without a word, he reached out and embraced his son. The embrace was warm, filled with a quiet forgiveness that needed no explanation. "There is nothing to forgive, my son," the father said. "You have learned a hard lesson, but you have learned it well. Anger is not wrong, but it must be tempered with wisdom. It can give you strength, but it can also lead you to destruction if you let it rule your heart." The young man nodded, tears filling his eyes. He had learned the truth of his father's words through his own pain and mistakes. "The land is not dead," the father continued. "It is wounded, but it can heal. And so can you. Together we will rebuild." With his father's guidance, the young man began to work the land once more, but this time he worked with patience, with care, and with a deep respect for the forces that were beyond his control. He no longer tried to force the land to yield more than it could. He no longer allowed his anger to cloud his judgment. And over time the land began to heal. The crops grew again, strong and healthy, nourished by the very soil that had once been damaged. The farm flourished not because of the young man's furious efforts, but because he had learned to work with the land rather than against it. The storm had taken much, but it had also given something in return. A deeper understanding of the balance between destruction and creation, between anger and wisdom, between the power of the human will and the humility needed to accept what cannot be changed. As Jesus finished the story, the fire before them crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the faces of his disciples. The weight of the story hung in the air, each disciple reflecting on the deeper truths it carried. Jesus looked at them with compassion, his eyes filled with love and understanding. "Anger," he said softly, "is a powerful force. It can drive you to act, to fight against injustice, to protect the weak. But if it is left unchecked, it will consume you. Like fire, it can either destroy or purify depending on how it is used." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Do not fear your anger, but do not let it rule your heart. Let it show you where the world is broken, where there is injustice, but always guide it with wisdom and love. Only then can it be a force for good." Peter, who had been listening intently, felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The anger he had been carrying no longer felt like a burden. He understood now that anger could be transformed into something greater, something that could bring about change, but only if it was tempered with wisdom. "Let your anger motivate you to seek justice," Jesus said, his voice filled with warmth, "but let love lead your way. Anger without love will only bring destruction, but anger guided by love can bring healing." The disciples sat in silence, each one absorbing the lesson. They had all felt anger in their hearts, but now they understood how to channel it, how to use it without being consumed by it. As the night grew darker and the fire began to die down, the disciples felt a new strength rising within them. They knew the challenges ahead would be great, but they also knew that with Jesus' guidance, they could face them without fear. The fire in their hearts had been transformed, no longer a source of destruction, but a light that would guide them on their path. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.